Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me up there as well, very clearly? Yep, fantastic. Okay. It's a great privilege to address this conference. Thank you so much. I was lucky enough to speak as a panelist last year. It was a great day of discussions, and I'm very grateful to be able to kick off another fantastic set of panels with so many panelists and experts that I respect very greatly. I've been at The Economist for 15 months now, so not very long. I'm still learning how to be a journalist, learning from some of the greats like Tim and other veterans of this field. And I thought I would talk a little bit about, I would think out loud about some of the things I've worked on for the past 15 months and how they tie together. So one of the dominating themes has been technology. Technology, emerging technology, how it affects conflict, how it affects military operations. That's come up again and again in what I've written about. It's come up again and again in the conferences I go to for armed forces around the world, in international summits. It's a subject that would not necessarily have been as high up on the agenda of these events 15 years ago, but is now dominating many of them. So I'll tackle two questions in turn. One of them is how technology may be affecting and changing conflict. And the second one is thinking a little bit more about where we should be looking for conflict to potentially take place. Before I dive into that, I thought I would just take our minds somewhere else. If you could imagine, let's see if I have the clicker correctly. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong way. If I can just get you to imagine a jungle, and imagine a Navy plane swooping low over that jungle and dropping a bunch of devices from that plane through the canopy, lodged into the ground. Now, hands up if you think you know what that is. For a military audience, I'd expect at least some people to have a rough sense, slightly worried by the fact that no one wants to ID this. Okay, fine. I'm sure you're being very modest. That is a spike buoy, an acoustic sensor, lodges into the ground, listens for voices or truck ignitions or small noises. Other things falling from this notional plane that we're imagining over this jungle are seismic detectors. May look a little bit like that. They can pick up vibrations in the ground, slight changes, slight tremors on the surface. And other still are more exotic sniffing sensors that can pick up the smell of human urine by detecting changes in the ammonia in the air. Now imagine 20,000 of these sensors dropped, scattered all across that jungle, beaming their data to drones hovering above continuously. And those drones are channeling that data, funneling it to powerful computers a few hundred miles away. Those computers are crunching the data, fusing all the data from those sensors, and an algorithm is working out where are the insurgents moving based on my triangulation of all of this data. The computer spits out a grid square, and in minutes, bombers are on their way to blanket that grid square with munitions. If you're a lawyer, I'm aware that doesn't entirely comply with your rules of engagement, but let's imagine that for a moment. So we have an example there in what I've just spelt out of an essentially nearly automated command and control system for prosecution of operations on the battlefield enabled by artificial intelligence. Oops, have I turned this? There we are. That is Operation Igloo White, and it begins in 1967. And it's America's effort to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, running from Laos into Vietnam. Now, spoiler alert, doesn't go terribly well. Some of you may be aware how that turns out. It costs about $1 billion a year, about $100,000 per truck destroyed, which is not the best cost-exchange ratio you can imagine. But I raise that to temper some of our discussions around technology today. I write a lot. I've just come from a week of NATO discussions where very high on the agenda were subjects of emerging technology. So artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, anti-space capabilities, ASAT missiles, and so on. And I don't mean to belittle the importance of any of those areas to the future work that you will do and the way they'll slot into the work that armed forces do. But every time I write about these things, including, in this case, AI, I'm reminded of how the fundamentals of these things are not new. So just a couple more examples of this before I continue on. Some of you, hands up if anyone, who saw China's military parade on October 1st, or some of the footage from it, the PLA parade? Anyone? Yeah, okay, so I'm reassured that a few of you are tracking what our peer competitors are up to. Many of you will have seen the DF-17. This glitzy, sleek, new hypersonic gliding vehicle atop a ballistic missile booster, paraded very prominently in the upper echelon of China's most fancy capabilities. And hypersonic missiles, I can tell you, as someone who attends lots of conferences these days, hypersonic missiles are the new obsession of many policymakers who are thinking about the implications of technology on future conflict. And that's right and proper. But does anyone know what that is? Good, well, one person knows what that is. That's great. That's not a bad ratio. That's the dinosaur, as it was wonderfully called by the US Air Force. It was a hypersonic glide vehicle that was built in 1957. So, a long time ago. This is not new technology. This is a slow, steady maturation of technology that dates to the beginning of the Cold War. Let's take another example. In yesterday's NATO declaration, some of you may have noted that the alliance declared space as an operational domain for the first time in its history. And of course, in the last year, we have seen the United States, the UK, and France all establish specialized different sorts of space units, whether space commands or other space organizations, in novel and important ways with great fanfare. They've done so on the basis that there's a profusion of anti-satellite and anti-space threats. As the Americans say, space is congested and contested. And that is true. But here is a Soviet anti-satellite weapon, a co-orbital satellite, a co-orbital weapon designed to sidle up to other satellites slowly in orbit and smash into them surreptitiously or not so surreptitiously if you're smashing into it, from 1963. And of course, the first anti-satellite kinetic missiles, direct descent missiles, date to the 1950s. I think the first test is in 1957. Okay, so what's the point of all this? The first is that technology is not going to transform warfare in as dramatic and rapid a way as I think we sometimes assume. These things take decades to mature and unfold, and I suspect we will be talking about applications of AI in conflict in much the same way we are today in 20 years' time. And actually, the applications we'll be looking at are going to be quite modest things, often at the back end, often very specialized. They're not going to see the full-fledged vision of automated battlefields in the timescale that policymakers that I speak to sometimes think that we are seeing. The other one is that how countries adapt and use technology is as important as how good they are at developing it. That's true from the Vietnam case, where you can have incredibly sophisticated levels of technology, sensor fusion, AI, incredible levels of computing power, buzzwords that we talk about today that America was doing at the cutting edge in the 1960s, to no great military effect. But also that countries that are able to use these in innovative and interesting ways are those that will succeed. And the naval historians amongst you will know that to be the case from the history of aircraft carriers in the interwar period and from countless other pieces of military technology. That's true also of things like AI. It's true of hypersonic gliders. It's true of other sorts of cutting-edge capabilities. So what other conclusions can we draw about how technology will shape conflict? Well, most of you will recognize that slide from the news in recent months. One of them is that we spend a lot of our time thinking about the cutting edge, talking about US, China, advances in quantum computing, quantum communications, the bleeding edge. But actually, the thing I noticed from writing about technology on a sort of week-to-week basis is that it's clear that a wider range of states are going to have access to more sophisticated weapons than they did, and more sophisticated means of cueing them than they could have hoped to have 20 years ago. The gap between the advanced states and the medium powers is narrowing. In particular, precision-guided munitions and the means to deliver them to targets will fall into the hands of less capable states. Now, Iran may not be classified as a less capable state, given its long history in this area, but I think many people were nonetheless impressed by the relative sophistication of the attack they were able to mount against Saudi Arabian oil facilities a couple of months ago. This begins to connect to broader diplomatic trends as well. We are seeing a steady erosion, a steady breakdown of various sorts of non-proliferation and arms control schemes and architectures. That is the 9M728, or NATO designation, the SSC-8, and it is a Russian intermediate-range missile that, of course, is the weapon that prompted America back in August to walk out of the 30-year-old Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. And that breakdown of that sort of arms control, and the fact that rising powers like China sit completely outside the architecture of that arms control that was built up between the US and the Soviet Union painstakingly over the Cold War, means that we're going to see a heightened threat from all sorts of conventional missiles and conventional projectiles, both simple and crude, up to the sort of medium capabilities that we saw Iran employ, up to the very high end that Russia is deploying in battalions in Europe today, which will have all sorts of implications for us, from defense of the homeland, which of course has for so long, for Western publics, been seen as a sanctuary, and to the way that we structure our armed forces. So this is already having consequences for the ways in which military services, including the British Army, but also navies, Marine Corps, are thinking about the shape of their future forces, the way they have to fight. This is from the guidance published by the Commandant of the Marine Corps in the United States in the summer, and it's made waves in American military circles because it's, I think, rightly seen as quite a drastic change in the way they think about questions of dispersal, big, high-signature platforms, and even someone who is not as accustomed to military jargon as many of you can understand what that means and what message the Marine Corps is sending to their big brothers in the US Navy with that very pointed message. And I think they do so entirely intentionally. Let's just talk a minute about other sorts of ways in which technology is changing conflict, specifically the different domains in which it's being fought. If I could, there we go. I think you'll all be familiar with the basic idea that we're seeing competition spread across different domains. So not just air, land, and sea, but also more and more in the electromagnetic spectrum in ways that we have seen interesting indications of in conflicts like Syria, where Russia has battle-tested new ways of fighting, has battle-tested new forms of electronic warfare, but also in cyberspace, where we've seen some fascinating efforts to try and practice deterrence in cyberspace with US attacks on IRGC networks, with US efforts to try and implant vulnerabilities in Russian critical national infrastructure, and of course, Russian and Chinese intrusions in the other direction. And in outer space as well, where the reliance on space assets is growing, and was very evident in some of the recent announcements we saw at the NATO summit. This is what the Americans call multi-domain operations, and no doubt you have your own doctrinal terms for it. What I think is most interesting about this from a sort of non-military point of view, from a policymaker's point of view, if you step back and how sort of Whitehall may see it, is a few things. One is the entanglement between the tactical and the strategic that occurs in many of these cases. We see this in space, where some of the same satellites that are picking up basic things that will be fed to battlefield commanders, like Scud missile launches, for example, are some of the same space capabilities that are also tasked with watching all the time for Russian submarine-launched ballistic missile launches in the North Pole. And that if one of those satellites is taken out, say by Russia, or a peer competitor that is quite rightly and legitimately believes that these are military targets that are performing a battlefield function, feeding intelligence to commanders, and therefore a fair game. If one of those is taken out, these are America's CHACR satellites, an overhead infrared system that watches for the heat signature and the plumes of smoke from ballistic missile launches. If one is taken out, that can result in big 40-minute gaps in American coverage of the North Pole. Now, if your task is to know when Russia has launched a nuclear missile at you, that will make decision makers very jumpy indeed. So this question of fighting across different domains also has all sorts of implications for big strategic issues. What's very clear to me is this summer I went to Colorado and California to visit lots of US Air Force bases where what they call their space warfighters, as the US Air Force likes to call them, are honing their craft in the new US Space Command that's been established, and it is in part of the new Space Force that will eventually be set up as a independent military service. What was very clear to me is how they realize how sharp the threat is from Chinese, Russian, other, even Iranian, North Korean anti-space capabilities, not just missiles, but also lasers, electromagnetic interference, GPS jamming on the ground, all of these things. But they don't have a clear sense of red lines. They're still very much working out the rules off the road in this area. They understand the tactics. They need to defend their satellites, harden their satellites, have evasive maneuvers for satellites. They need to have better space situational awareness of what's going on in space. But what they don't know is the thresholds. They don't understand how Russia or China might react if you jam or dazzle a significant satellite for long periods. What's the difference between temporary jamming and kinetic destruction? How would an adversary respond? That is still being worked out, even as these capabilities are being deployed. So, just to wrap up, the paradox is this. We often assume technology is going to speed up conflict. Missiles can travel faster, software can make decisions more quickly, autonomous weapons will fight at the speed of machines, and that this will compress decision-making more and more. Back in March, Heiko Maas, Germany's foreign minister, warned that maneuverable missiles traveling at many times the speed of sound barely leave time for considered human responses. Well, okay, first of all, remember that part at the beginning. Today's ballistic missiles re-enter the atmosphere at speeds that are quicker than hypersonic missiles, because, of course, hypersonic missiles have to be more maneuverable. So don't assume that everything is new. Actually, we're familiar with lots of these problems. But even if that's the case, in a world in which you have that speed, so things happening much more quickly, and in which there are more dimensions of conflict to juggle, in which you will be contesting with an adversary on their digital networks, you'll be blinding their satellites, and they'll be blinding yours, and you'll be judging at what stage is it more advantageous to escalate the kinetic attacks, what will be the consequences of that, as well as your traditional forms of warfighting. That's a world in which the risks of escalation are much more difficult to manage. Now, the political response to that is not going to be to shrug and say, okay, war is getting faster, good luck with it, have fun, use your initiative. It's going to be one in which decision makers are tightening their grip of conflict. They will be much more wary of ceding control of these things to military officers. I cannot see political leaders accepting that sort of loss of control. Now, in my view, that may increase the degree to which political leaders restrict or even micromanage conflict. We are seeing nascent efforts to try and rebuild some of these rules of the road, to try and discuss them. We are seeing, for example, Germany mount a missile dialogue, attempting to think about how these big powers are introducing new missiles in their arsenals. In the last few days, we have seen President Emmanuel Macron argue that we need to have a new discussion with Russia about the INF Treaty. There are all sorts of efforts underway at the United Nations to talk about rules of the road in cyberspace. And of course, very embryonic discussions about things like autonomous weapons, the way in which we define meaningful human control of autonomous capabilities, but these are at a very early stage. And I think if I was leaving you with sort of two thoughts, one of them is that let's spend a bit of time mining our history to think about the implications of all of this, because an enormous amount has been thought about going back to the very early days of the Cold War. And the second is, it will tighten the connection between political leaders and military commanders. It will not necessarily result in a what some authors have called hyperwar. It may result actually in tighter degrees of political control over conflict. I'll stop there, and we can go into a broader discussion of some of the alliance implications of this, the diplomatic aspects of all of this, in our next panel. So thank you very much.